Hello everybody, this is a video about Ireland. I'll start with the Telegraph, but I'm going to go mainly to Michael Lewis's Vanity Fair article. Telegraph: Irish bank flight quickens despite EU rescue. Deposit flight from Irish banks accelerated sharply at the end of last year on fears of political turmoil, suggesting that the EU IMF rescue package for Ireland failed to restore confidence. That was the subheading from Ambrose Evans Pritchard article, Feb 2nd. Irish Central Bank data showed losses of €40 billion in deposits from key banks in December, compared with €27 billion a month earlier. Over the past year, Irish lenders have hemorrhaged 110 billion, so it's gone 27 billion, 40 billion, and the whole of the year was 110, so this looks like it's ramping up. Investors are watching warily as Ireland prepares for an election on February the 25th. Leading opposition party Fine Gael said it will unpick parts of the EU IMF bailout for Ireland, threatening to impose losses on bondholders who lent to collapsed domestic banks. Those who lent recklessly, as well as those who borrowed recklessly, should share the burden, said Michael Noonan, the party's finance chief. He exhorted the EU to cut the interest rate on rescue loans from 5.8% to levels nearer the EU borrowing cost of 2.6%. Which is a big ask. Let's say they do reduce it. I mean, their borrowing costs aren't 2.6, they're an awful lot higher than that. But say they reduce it down to what it is now, roughly 6, say down to 4. Then let's hypotheticalize that Spain is borrowing in the open market at 6, and bailed out Ireland would be borrowing at 4. I mean, it's not an easy situation. It looks to me zugzwangs all round. So Vanity Fair, who have got a question and answer session with Michael Lewis on the politicians that sank Ireland. I'll take this from it. Amazingly, Finance Minister Brian Lenihan convinced the Irish government to nationalise the private debts of not one but 3 of Ireland's biggest banks, and the ruling political party, Fine Gael, has been allowed to stay in power just long enough to firmly set the hook in every Irishman's mouth. Having recently accepted a bailout worth €85 billion from the EU and IMF, this ruling political party will not be ruling much longer, as its Prime Minister, Brian Cowen, will certainly be pushed out after an early election occurs sometime before March. The hate for Cowen is so unanimous and widespread, etc. It goes on. Later we get, how do you think the Irish will react? This is asking Lewis how the Irish will react to his article. I think they're starting to get angry about what's happening to them. They're beginning to experience such real effects on their own living standards that I would be surprised if I wouldn't be surprised if it's warmly received. In other words, he thinks that his article will be warmly received by the Irish people. And I'll throw in here now, Michael Lewis, for me, since this economic thing began in 2007, I think he's been wonderful. The people in Ireland who might be pissed off about the article, the bankers and politicians, have so many bigger problems, it's going to be one more thing and they'll pay no attention. But the people who are upset and are looking to have their situation explained from an outsider's point of view might actually be interested in it. This is why I'm doing this video, so Irish people or people interested can read it and see the outsider's dispassionate view of what went on. Next is an International Business Times CNBC interview with Michael Lewis about the Irish situation. And I made a note here of one of his quotes from that article. It's incredible with what they put up with. To the casual observer, Michael Lewis himself and his crew, we came to the conclusion that the Irish actually enjoy suffering. So, the Vanity Fair article, When Irish Eyes Are Crying, and I've pulled out some stuff from it. It's 9 pages long, and it's all free on the interwebs. Follow the links below. Remarkable that we can get such quality work like this free. The Irish nouveau riche may have created a Ponzi scheme, but it was a Ponzi scheme in which they themselves believed. So too, for that matter, did some large number of ordinary Irish citizens who bought houses for fantastic sums. Ireland's 87% rate of home ownership is among the highest in the world. There's no such thing as a non-recourse home mortgage in Ireland. Now it's more than vaguely important. The guy who pays too much for his house is not allowed to simply hand the keys back and walk away, as they do in America. Many states in America, anyway. He's on the hook, personally, for whatever he borrowed. Across Ireland, people are unable to extract themselves from their houses or their bank loans. Irish people will tell you that because of their sad history of dispossession, owning a home is not just a way to avoid paying rent, but a mark of freedom. In the rush to freedom, the Irish built their own prisons, and their leaders helped them do it. This is later in the article. On March the 13th, 2008, 6 months before the Irish real estate Ponzi scheme collapsed, Ingram, who worked for Merrill Lynch at the time, published a report in which he simply quoted verbatim what British market insiders had told him about various banks lending to commercial real estate. The Irish banks were making far riskier loans in Ireland than they were in Britain. But even in Britain, the report revealed, they were the nuttiest lenders around. In that category, Anglo-Irish, Bank of Ireland and AIB came in that order, first, second and third. That's first, second and third nuttiest lenders in Britain, and they were nuttier in Ireland. For a few hours, the Merrill Lynch report, Ingram's report, was the hottest read in the London financial markets, until Merrill Lynch retracted it. Ingram's superiors at Merrill Lynch hauled him into meetings with in-house lawyers who toned down the report's pointed language and purged it of its damning quotes from market insiders, including many references to Irish banks. And from the moment everything Ingram wrote about the Irish banks was edited and boulderized by Merrill Lynch's lawyers, that's what they did. They just crushed it and everything he wrote, and at the end of 2008 Merrill fired him. Slightly later, it would have been difficult for Merrill Lynch's investment bankers not to know, at some level, that in a reckless market the Irish banks had acted with recklessness all of their own. But in the 7-page memo to Brian Lenihan, for which the Irish taxpayers forked over to Merrill Lynch €7 million, they kept whatever reservations they might have had to themselves. They said, all of the Irish banks are profitable and well capitalized. This was after Ingram was squashed. They knew, but they took the 7 million and wrote rubbish. So, Vanity Fair again in VF Daily, Michael Lewis on how Merrill Lynch and Brian Lenihan stuck the people of Ireland with a debt of €106 billion. Lewis interviewed Lenihan in an attempt to uncover the man's reasoning for his actions. The main pivot point of everything is the throwing the Irish state behind the banks. Lenihan asserted that he had no choice in the matter. Under English law, he explained to Lewis, bondholders enjoy the same status as ordinary depositors. Technically correct. But as Lewis points out, this is legalistic, narrowly true but generally false. The Irish government always had the power to impose losses on even the senior bondholders if it wanted to. When he made the decision in 2008, Lenihan said it was done to prevent contagion. But as Lewis points out, this wasn't true either. A year and a half later, Lenihan offered a different reasoning, claiming that the bonds were owned by Irishmen. The Irish, in other words, Lewis writes, were simply saving the Irish. And this wasn't true. The bondholders were mainly foreigners. In summation, Lewis writes, soon Brian Lenihan will stand up in the Irish Parliament and offer a fourth explanation for why private investors in Ireland's banks cannot be allowed to take losses. There's simply no way that this country, whose banks are so dependent on international investors, can unilaterally renege on senior bondholders against the wishes of the ECB, European Central Bank. He will say, this, as Lewis points out, is just circular logic. If Lenihan had never guaranteed the bank's losses with money borrowed from the ECB, then the Irish wouldn't be at the mercy of the ECB, of the ECB's wishes. Next link below is Bloomberg, and Iceland shows Ireland did wrong things. It's a comparison between Iceland and Ireland, where I pulled out this Joseph Stiglitz quote. Iceland did the right thing by making sure its payment systems continued to function, while the creditors, not the taxpayers, shouldered the losses of the banks, says Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, an economic professor at Columbia University, New York. Ireland's done all the wrong things. On the other hand, that's probably the worst model, but basically that's the quote. Ireland's done all the wrong things. FT.com, S&P warns of unsure future for Irish debt. Senior bondholders at this is right up to no, it's February 2nd again. Senior bondholders at Irish banks face increased uncertainty over whether they will be repaid if Fine Gael and Labour form the next Irish government, a credit rating agency has warned. Enda Kenny, this is later in the article, Enda Kenny, leader of the centre-right Fine Gael party, said a new government could not address Ireland's economic plight. If we continue to write blank cheques to reckless bankers, polls suggest, that's what the quote was, polls suggest Fine Gael will emerge with the largest number of seats and will seek to form a government with Labour, its traditional coalition partners. However, this is right towards the end, however, they point out the European Central Bank, which is underwriting the Irish banking system with 130 billion of liquidity support, is strongly opposed to any move to write down senior bond debt for fear this would affect the ability of other banks across the Eurozone to fund themselves. And I'll return to a paragraph from Michael Lewis there that I've already read, but I'll read again. In summation, Lewis writes, soon Brian Lenihan will stand up in the Irish Parliament, we now know he won't, but offer a fourth explanation for why private investors in Ireland banks cannot be allowed to take losses. Might not be Lenihan who says this, but you'll hear it soon. There is simply no way that this country, whose banks are so dependent on international investors, can unilaterally renege on senior bondholders against the wishes of the ECB. This, as Lewis points out, is circular logic. If Lenihan had never agreed guaranteeing the bank's losses with money borrowed from the ECB, then the Irish wouldn't be at the mercy of the ECB's wishes. But this is the point we get to in the run-up to the election. He did. Your elected representative, representing you, has signed international contracts with various peoples for various things. And reneging on contracts is a very, very dodgy water to go swimming in. It's a no-win situation, but don't think in Ireland that you can just elect some other people and everything will be all right. Be absolutely assured it will not. Bye.